Hey there, friends. It is the Bearded Wonder, and we are here to talk about another great idea. Not really. We're going to be talking about proxy wars again. Vietnam, not a great idea. This one's going to be called the Soviet Union's Vietnam, which means it's also not a great idea, but as we'll see, it's really not a great idea for the Soviet Union or the United States. So, we're talking about the Soviet-Afghan War. It starts in the late 1970s when some people in Afghanistan start deciding that they want to be communist. There are also some other people in the country that don't want to be communist, and so this starts out as what we would term a civil war. In other words, it's two groups of people inside of a country, both fighting for control of the government of that country. So far, not a big deal. But since we're calling it the Soviet-Afghanistan War, at some point we're going to have to get that Soviet influence into it. And in this case, this is where the United States kind of idea of containment and the Soviet idea of anti-containment or spreading communism comes into play. In this case, the Soviets are going to support the communists, and we can also say at this point that the Americans are going to support the anti-communists because this is just what we do. And because we're calling it the Soviet Union's Vietnam, this time the Soviet Union are going to be the ones that get into the mess directly. You can see here, called it first. And so they get their army into Afghanistan, and as we're going to see here in a minute, that's pretty good thing for America, at least in the short term. Afghanistan has a lot of mountains, and it turns out that the anti-communists are really good at hiding from the communists, including the Soviet Union, and so they start spending a lot of money, having a lot of people die, just kind of like America did in Vietnam. So, the Americans are going to make the decision this is a proxy war after all, which means that we have to fight against the Soviet Union without fighting against the Soviet Union, and in this case that means that we have to give stuff to the anti-communists. And so we give them or make offers of millions of dollars, weapons, CIA training, all that good old stuff to kill some commies, because that's what we're all about in the United States. And at this point, you might be blowing your whistle and calling a foul and saying, hold up, maybe we should find out who we're giving all these weapons and money to. After all, just because they're fighting against our enemies, does that really make them our friends? And in this case, that's a fair question to ask. Because if we're going to think not too far back in world history, Stalin was fighting against Hitler. He was our enemy. That doesn't really make Stalin a stand-up chap and somebody that we really want to support. Okay, you're saying that's only one time. Well, I could give you some other examples. For example, Saddam Hussein in the Iraq-Iran war. We kind of helped Saddam Hussein out, thought that he was a pretty good guy because we didn't like the Iranians at the time. And now we're kind of getting the gist, and yeah, I could list a bunch of other ones as well. We're not going to for time's sake, but let's suffice it to say that we should have known better. But we don't, and so we give money, weapons, and training to the people who are the anti-communists. In this case, they are a group of people called the Mujahideen. Now, we might not know who the Mujahideen is, but you'll probably recognize them by other names, for example, Taliban and Al-Qaeda are a part of the Mujahideen. They are anti-communists, and so because they are anti-communists, we give them the weapons and the money and the training that we promised, and a lot of them end up in the hands of a guy named Osama bin Laden. And now we're seeing the bad idea. Now this is a bad idea for everybody. As you can see here, the Soviets are going to flush a lot of money down the toilet again, fighting in a war that they ultimately end up losing. That's why we call it the Soviet Union's Vietnam. But it's also a bad idea for the Americans because they get the idea that Osama bin Laden's actually a good guy. You can see this newspaper. It's from 1990. 1991 or 1993, I can't remember. But it's basically calling him an anti-Soviet warrior and talking about him putting his army on the road to peace. Obviously, this newspaper looks a little bit silly to us in 2020. Obviously didn't to them. And so we go from having the Soviet-Afghanistan war, Soviet Union has now quit, to just the Afghanistan war. Now it's the same war, it's just that the sides have changed, and in this case the United States is going to actually jump over to the other side of the war. That's right, folks, we've actually fought on both sides of the same war. In this case now, we're going to decide that we are going to support the anti-communists against the other anti-communists, even though we gave the other anti-communists weapons and training at one point. And so, kind of makes this whole situation feel a little bit like a bad idea. And yes, I am serious. This is what we've done. Now, I'm not trying to make a political stand and say that we shouldn't have killed bin Laden. He's a bad guy, definitely deserved to have justice done. What I am saying is that there's a lot of historical precedents for going into other countries where we're not really sure who we're supporting or fighting against, and maybe we should slow down and make sure that we're actually fighting on the right side of a war before we get into it. And I would encourage you to really think about how much you know right now about the Afghanistan government. If I'm being completely honest with you, I don't know enough to know that we're on a good side of the war. Sometimes there's not a good side of the war, and it's definitely worth finding out before we make up our minds about whether we should be getting into wars or not. And I would encourage us all to do that. I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't support this particular war. That's for each of us as American citizens to decide. I'm just saying that maybe we should know a little bit more facts individually before we decide what we think or what we don't. That's it for me today. I hope you have a good day.